Congressman, it's wonderful to see you. I think the last time I saw you was in Shaw. For those of you joining, I'm not only in the district, but also happy and often had the opportunity to share a synagogue service with a congressman. So let me firstly introduce myself, Gideon Taylor. I'm the CEO of the Jewish Community Relations Council of New York. And we are very excited today to be joined by the chairman of the House Judiciary Committee from New York's 10th Congressional District, which includes much of the west side of Manhattan and parts of Brooklyn. Congressman Jerrold Nadler, a longtime friend of JCRC, a partner with us in so much of what we do, and so engaged in so many of the issues that we're dealing with. So welcome, Congressman. Thank you for joining us.
I'm glad to be here.
Terrific. So one issue I just sort of wanted to put on, just sort of ask you about, I'm not sure if you saw recently, just yesterday, there was an ugly graffiti placed outside an Israeli restaurant just on 73rd Street on the Upper West Side about Jews. And I think it was just an example of rising hate crime that's affected not only Jews, but many New Yorkers. And this was an incidence of property damage and graffiti, but it's obviously something that sort of stretched out and extended into physical attacks. And I just wanted to ask you your thoughts on it and how you see this phenomenon of hate crime and what your sense is of what the future and what it is we can do to address this.
Well, yes, the attack on the Miriam restaurant at 74th and Amsterdam is 4 blocks from my house. I'm very well aware of that particular crime, but I'm well aware of lots of other hate crimes, anti-Semitic, anti-Asian. That's been a particular problem recently. Anti-Black, that's throughout American history. Well, I chair the Judiciary Committee, and we have jurisdiction over a lot of issues that deal with this, deal with hate crimes, that deal specifically with anti-Semitism. I'm also the head of the informal Jewish caucus in the House, and I'm the dean of the New York delegation, and I'm the only, people don't realize this, but I'm the only Jewish member from New York City. And with Congressman Zeldin's running for governor, probably soon the only Jewish congressman from the state. But the Judiciary Committee, we've been quite active on this. We held a hearing just yesterday, or our crime subcommittee held a hearing just yesterday on the rise on violence against minority institutions. During the hearing, I talked about the generational trauma that American Jews have experienced. And this is obviously a legacy of thousands of years of anti-Semitism, and every act of anti-Semitism is part of an ongoing story. But this traumatizes communities. Now, we've been fighting anti-Semitism for a long time, obviously. Now, we recently passed the COVID-19 Hate Crimes Act, which included the Jabara Hire No Hate Act, which enhances the Department of Justice's ability to fight anti-Semitism by strengthening it strengthens hate crimes education and reporting by local law enforcement, particularly to identify and help prosecute anti-Semitic hate crimes. And obviously, we're seeking robust funding for the institution security program that provides funding for security around synagogues and other potential targets.
Right, which is wonderful. And as you know, the JCRC, together with UJA, we run the Community Security Initiative, which works with, we have a 10-member team that go around from synagogues and other institutions, works also with institutions outside the Jewish community, advising them on how to harden the targets. And unfortunately, a skill that we've developed over the years and had to really ramp up. And the helping those institutions access those grants has been just so pivotal. And so we are so appreciative of your leadership role in this issue. As you know, Congressman, I grew up in Europe, in Ireland, and I came here 30 years ago. And I remember when I first came here, as I think we once spoke about, the freedom to walk into a synagogue, the freedom, I really felt the difference when I first came and moved to New York. And here we are 30 years later and facing challenges.
What's very interesting is that although every polling data over the last polling data since World War II really shows a steady decline in anti-Semitism, but the relatively small number of extremists are getting more emboldened, apparently, because we're getting more and more threats and more acts of violence, even though the acceptability of American Jews is at an all-time high.
Right.
Which presents a different problem, because if that weren't true, we wouldn't have the problem of intermarriage we have in a Jewish continuity, but that's a different subject.
Right. And, and as you know, our work at JCRC is to working with our partners in the community and in different communities of faith and ethnic communities on combating hate. And I think this unified approach is one for JCRC, for us, and with your partnership and support is I think going to be a key focus for us going forward with this rising challenge. I thought it would be helpful also just to turn to some other issues, not quite directly related to the community, but that are of concern to us as Americans. Maybe if you can share with us a little bit about the voting rights efforts, voting and the leadership role you've taken on this issue, and just share with us what your sort of thoughts are and how you see this going.
Well, the voting rights are at a crucial problem right now. We passed, I shouldn't say we, I wasn't the part of Congress then, but back in 1965, Congress passed the Voting Rights Act, and in particular passed Section 5. Section 5 requires jurisdictions that have a history of racial discrimination in voting to pre-clear any change in their laws or regulations. And this might be how many polling places there are, where the polling places are, requirements for voting, gerrymandering, or any of that has to be pre-cleared with the Civil Rights Division of the Justice Department to make sure that it's not further discrimination. And the reason for this is that prior to Section 5 being enacted, I mean, discrimination in voting was illegal, but prior and Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act continued to make it illegal, but that wasn't new. That wasn't new. But to enforce it, the Justice Department would say, aha, you're doing this to discriminate, and they would sue in court. And that lawsuit would go on for several years. The Justice Department would win it. They'd stop that practice. The state would stop that practice and invent a new one, which would go in for litigation for several years. So you have this game of whack-a-mole in which you never caught up and voting rights were denied. The Section 5 pre-clearance said any jurisdictions with a history of voting discrimination had to get any regulation, law change, any change, pre-cleared, approved by either the Justice Department or by the Federal District Court in Washington. We renewed this act back in 1982. In fact, it was expanded somewhat in 1982. It was renewed several times. Back in 1986, the last time it was renewed, I co-chaired with Steve Chabot, a Republican from Ohio. He was the chairman of the Civil Rights Subcommittee, and I was the ranking Democrat. We co-chaired hours and hours of hearings, getting thousands of pages of record, because the Supreme Court had said you had to have those extensive records to justify these provisions. And the Voting Rights Act was renewed 420 or something to 10 in the House, and unanimously, or 99-1 or something in the Senate, for 25 years. But in 2013, 9 years ago, the Supreme Court upset the apple cart in the decision of Shelby County versus Holder, in which they said that, well, Section 4 of the Act, Section 5 is a pre-clearance, Section 4 of the Act defines which jurisdictions are subject to the pre-clearance provisions, to Section 5. Section 4 of the act was now unconstitutional because it was based on data from previous discrimination, and because there was no longer this discrimination going on, so you didn't need it. Justice Ginsburg, in her dissent, famously said that this was like that throwing out the preclearance when it was working was like throwing away your umbrella in a rainstorm because you're not getting wet. Not surprisingly, barely hours after the court's decision, several states immediately rushed to pass voter suppression laws, knowing that these laws could now only be challenged under Section 2 after the fact, after the damage had been done, and that you'd reestablish the game of whack-a-mole. The John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, which I led the effort for in the House along with several others, but as chairman of the Judiciary Committee, I shepherded it through the House, would establish a new coverage formula, a new Section 4, so that DOJ can once again review the laws before they come into effect to ensure that they do not discriminate. In other words, reestablish preclearance. It would make some other changes and fix some other court decisions. But as I said, we passed it through the House. Unfortunately, voting rights are no longer as popular as they were back in 2005, and they're held up by a filibuster in the Senate. There's a majority, but it's held up by a filibuster in the Senate, and it's essentially, we enact this legislation soon, I think, but right now it's held up by a filibuster.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so maybe can we turn a little bit to Israel? Obviously, such a core part of your values and where the positions you've taken over the years. And as you know, for us at JCRC, we've worked hard to educate our public officials through visits, bringing people on visits to Israel. So there's to try and create understanding about the complexity of the Middle East. And we're working, as you know, on campuses and in other fora around New York and other venues to try to educate people about Israel and the challenges. So when something like the Amnesty report comes along, it's obviously so challenging for us, for anyone who cares about a fair and a balanced picture of Israel. So I was wondering if you could share with us what your thoughts are and how you see this BDS, how you see the Amnesty report, these calls of Israel and descriptions of Israel as an apartheid state, BDS. You know, how do you feel about, obviously we understand how you feel about it. What do you see can be done, and how do you see this moving forward?
Well, I'm obviously very much opposed to BDS for many years. I don't think I have to tell you that. And this Amnesty report is not a surprise. It duplicates what the UN, I forget which agency at the UN has been saying this for many, many years. There's an automatic majority in the UN, apparently now in Amnesty also, against Israel. But it does highlight a potential problem. Ever since Israel conquered the West Bank in 1967, there's been a potential problem. You've got the Jews, you got the Palestinians. Each of them has their own national aspirations. With a large influx of settlers, settlements into the West Bank, the only solution, in my opinion, is a two-state solution. Because otherwise, without a two-state solution, you have a choice, especially with the demographics. Given birth rates, et cetera, if you combine Israel, the Gaza Strip, and the West Bank, it's essentially even between Jews and Palestinians, and Palestinians will have a majority in a few years. And so you get a situation where if you don't have a two-state solution, which I'll elaborate on in a second, you either give the Palestinians the vote and treat them equally, as you should in democracy, in which case the dream of the Zionist dream goes up in smoke, there's no Jewish state, or you don't give them the vote and you rule them by force, in which case you would have an apartheid situation. So it is essential to have a two-state solution. And what worries me is that, and people talk about a two-state solution now. I think there's a fairly broad consensus that we have to have it. But you've got settler groups, violent settlers, who are slowly by force, pushing out Palestinians from more and more of the land. And the IDF is responding, but I don't think it's responding adequately enough. And I think the window on a two-state solution may be slowly closing, and that worries me a very great deal.
Are you optimistic that ultimately we will get to that point?
I don't know. I was optimistic for years, but in more recent times, watching the expansion of the settlements, the expansion of illegal settlements, illegal under Israeli law, which has nonetheless been a fait accompli, and you have a government now that is paralyzed really from acting in this area because it's a wall-to-wall government. I don't know if I'm optimistic about closing that window of opportunity.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, I hope the next time we talk, there'll be more. We'll all have more optimism. Maybe we could turn a little bit to some of the couple of the issues that are just of concern to obviously the Jewish community, particularly younger part of the Jewish community, the wider Jewish community, and the community generally. The environment, which is one that you've taken such been so engaged in. So one specific issue I just wanted to talk about was the announcement that the Port Authorities to resume federal environmental review for the cross-harbor freight movement program, which sounds pretty technical, but is of obviously of great significance. And just want to try to get your sense of that and generally where you see the challenges, the climate change challenges ahead.
Well, let me separate it into two questions. The more broader change is the climate change question generally, and that is catastrophic. Without question, at the rate we're going, I forget what number of years, the sea level is going to increase by a foot, which will inundate major portions of this country, although this country has enough money so that if we want to spend a huge amount of money, we can, to some extent, protect ourselves against that with, have resilience and build seawalls and that sort of thing. But there are large parts of the world which cannot. You could have hundreds of millions of people literally in areas which go below water. You could have island countries completely submerged, whole countries. You could have, and you will have, large parts of what is now productive farmland in Europe, North America, and Africa become desert, which means the food production capacity of the world looks to go way down. All this portends a huge problem eventually of survival for the human race. But even before you get to that, it portends huge migrations. Look at the problems that immigration is causing in the United States, the political problems in the United States, the political problems in Europe. This will be dwarfed by hundreds and hundreds of millions of people who will have to flee areas that they've lived in for thousands of years, which are now becoming deserts, and go to more arable lands. So it's a tremendous, almost existential problem. Now, coming back into the local, the rail freight tunnel, I was proud that Governor Hochul endorsed this in her State of the State, and I've been pursuing this project for 35 years. New York is the only city which never built a rail connection to the mainland, from the port to the mainland. It's the only port city. And the result is that huge amounts of freight, in fact, all our freight that we depend on in New York City and Long Island, in Westchester, in Connecticut, comes over the George Washington Bridge. That pollutes the air. It gives us the highest asthma rates in the world in the Bronx. It is incredibly energy inefficient. And freight volumes are expected to increase. I'm sorry, the freight volumes are expected to increase by 2040 by 37%, which would put an upward lid on economic development in the whole region. So the rail freight tunnel is a proposal, which, by the way, I've been working on it for 35 years. It was specifically the Port Authority was set up in 1921 to do this project, and for a variety of reasons, never got to it. But this would build a tunnel, a rail tunnel from Bay Ridge, Brooklyn, to the border between Bayonne and Jersey City in New Jersey, a rail freight tunnel, and it would join the national freight network to the Bay Ridge line that curves up from Bay Ridge to Fresh Pond Junction in Queens, and from there, the main line Long Island Railroad, or over the Hellgate Bridge to the Bronx, Connecticut, Westchester, and so forth. It would connect it, it would completely connect us. The environmental benefits would be tremendous, the economic benefits would be tremendous, and as I said, an essential project. Now, we have completed, or the Port Authority, I should say, has completed the Tier 1 EIS, Environmental Impact Statement, which narrowed the alternatives from 30 different alternatives to 2. An enhanced rail float project, because we do float rail, rail cars across the harbor, an enhanced float project, or building the tunnel. The EIS, the Tier 2 EIS, will recommend between those 2 alternatives. We'll come up with a total cost, which we estimate in the neighborhood of about $20 billion for the tunnel. And we'll come up with a financing mechanism. Now, $20 billion, by the way, sounds like a lot of money, but the cost benefit ratio is 2.2 to 1, which means that for the $20 billion, you get, what is it, 22 billion, $44 billion, no, more than that, 2.2 to 1. Someone else can do the math off the top of their head.
A lot.
So I am very hopeful that we will do this, and the governor has made it a priority.
That's terrific. Yeah, terrific. And I know the issues on people's minds, but you've looked at this issue for so many years. So maybe it's finally within grasp. Hopefully. Could we turn a little bit to the issue of healthcare disparity? So we have at JCRC, this is one of the issues that we work on with community partners at the local level, disparities. We have a coalition where we work with groups from outside of the Jewish community on healthcare disparities, particularly in Brooklyn, which is obviously such concern to us, and the impact on our society is so caustic and negative. So it's one that's really been on our minds, JCRC, and for the Jewish community. I know that's one that you've looked at a national level on issues around all kinds of medication, from insulin and COVID-19 treatments and other medication. Could you tell us a little bit about how you see, what opportunities you see on addressing this issue, obviously local level to some extent, and really at a national level, because it's such a deep concern for us and for the community?
Well, there are a number of things to do. I mean, in the longer term, because there's nothing like a majority for it now, we should have Medicare for all, as many of us have been advocating for a long time. In the more short term and politically feasible, we can deal with the soaring price of pharmaceutical drugs in a couple of ways. One, which is much more difficult politically, is to have Medicare negotiate the cost of drugs. Because why should we pay? Medicare pays more than, we pay more in this country than any other country for the same drugs from the same manufacturers. And Medicare has the size, the market volume to be able to force much lower prices if they were allowed. They're prohibited by law from doing this now for no good reason except the political power of big pharma at some point in the past. Secondly, and as I said, the pharmaceutical companies are charging Americans for 3, 4, even 10 times what they charge people in other countries for the same drugs. Same manufacturers, differential in price. Now, one of the things we can do is I introduced recently the Preserve Access to Affordable Generics and Biosimilars Act, which prohibits anti-competitive settlements that block access to affordable drugs. Now, what does this mean? Normally, you invent a drug, you patent a drug, you
Mhm.
get the patent rights for, I think, 12 years. And after that, a generic drug company can come and make the generic drug, and it comes out much, much cheaper. But what's happening now is the big pharmaceutical companies are making side deals with the generic drug companies in which they say, we'll pay you off, or we'll pay you not to bring out a generic for our drug. So the public doesn't get the benefit of the generic drug, of the generic drug price, because the deal was made between the generic company and the pharmaceutical company, in effect to evade the law, in effect to evade the Waxman Act of, I think, 1984 or whatever it was. So I've introduced the bill to prohibit that. It would prohibit this as antitrust settlements and amend antitrust law for that purpose. And obviously, I'm also proud to support the president's Build Back Better Act, which would ensure that people can in all states can access affordable health insurance, improve access to care, expand Medicaid, especially to the 12 states which never took it under the Affordable Care Act, and further lower the cost of prescription drugs. We've passed this legislation in the House. The Senate, it's pending, as you know, and we'll do what we can to push it, to ensure it's signed into law. Good.
All right, we'll be certainly tracking that issue closely as well. So one last question before we close. Women's rights, gender equality has obviously been an important goal for so many in the Jewish community, as in the wider community. And this has been an issue. You've been such a strong proponent of women's rights in the fight against sexual crimes. So you recently passed HR 4445 regarding the ending of forced arbitration of sexual assault and sexual harassment. So how will this benefit victims, and how do you see the issue more widely?
Well, this would ban forced arbitration for victims of sexual assault and sexual violence. We have a court system in this country. A court system is a civil court system which is intended to give you the opportunity to sue me to get justice if you think I've damaged you. And you get discovery, and you get proper procedures, which we've worked out over 200 years and going back centuries in English common law. And you get a jury trial, and that's appealable to the higher courts. There's also something called the American Arbitration Act, passed in 1922. The American Arbitration Act was intended to afford an opportunity for large corporations who had a dispute, if they preferred to have an arbitrator, because it sometimes is cheaper for the arbitration between two equal companies. There's no appeal from the arbitration. It's sometimes simpler. But over the years, the courts, and not Congress, Congress has not changed the law as far as I know. The courts have gradually expanded that, and so that now almost every contract you sign, if you sign a contract to buy a television set or a car or a house or do anything else, they will be buried in that contract, or even in a manual that's appended to the contract, a clause saying that in the event of a dispute between you and General Motors, it will go to arbitration. You have nothing to say about that, because if you don't want that, you can't cross that out, or you simply won't get the car or whatever. The same is true in employment contracts. You won't get the job. So in effect, it's a contract of adhesion. It's compulsory. And that means you go into arbitration. Now, the arbitrators are hired by the companies. And there's a bias toward the company because they want to get hired again. And that's why 98%, and by the way, if you lose an arbitration, you have to pay the company's fee. And that's why 98% of arbitrations are decided in favor of the company against the employee or the car buyer or whatever it might be. Now, I introduced, I should say, the FAIR Act, which would prohibit this entirely. We haven't been able to pass that yet, but we're going to continue. And I think it has a pretty good, we passed out of committee, and I think it has a very good chance of being on the floor in March and should pass the House. I don't know about the Senate, but we took the easy part of the bill, the more emotional part that deals only with sexual assaults and sexual harassment and assaults with sexual crimes. We made that a separate bill. Sherry Bustos was the major sponsor in the House, and we passed it in the House, and we passed it in the Senate, passed the Senate, I think, unanimously. It was a large bipartisan vote in the House, and the president will sign it shortly. So that will become law, prohibiting forced arbitration in sexual assault cases. And that's a major, major advance. But every argument you can make for that bill, for or against that bill, is the identical argument that you can make for the broader bill. And so we're going to bring that to the floor. And there's a lot less Republican support for it. The Democrats will support it unanimously, I think. But I'm hoping we can convince enough Republicans, now that we've passed the sexual assault bill, to say, look, the arguments that you made on the floor, people like Ken Buck and Morgan Griffith, who were major Republicans, were major supporters of the FAIR Act. I'm sorry, the Sexual Assault Act. And I said to them just before we adjourned for a few weeks, I said, look at it. It's the same argument. Everything you said on the floor can be said for the broader bill. Everything that was said against the bill that you disagreed with, it's exactly the same. They both said to me that, well, sexual assaults shock the conscience. I said, that's true. But how about racial discrimination? Or a million other kinds of discrimination are equally shocking the conscience. And anyway, why should it have to shock the conscience if you're treating somebody unfairly and depriving them of American justice? So I haven't heard back yet, but I'm hopeful we'll be able to pass the broader bill. I know we'll pass it in the House. I'm hopeful we can generate enough Republican support in the House to ping pong that for Republican support in the Senate.
Wow, you've certainly got a incredibly wide range of issues that you continue to have over your career and continue to grapple with and advocate.
Let me mention one other bill that I think is a couple of other bills that I think are very important. One is the Pregnant Workers Fairness Act, which I've sponsored. I've sponsored for the last 8 years. I think it's I think we have a good shot at getting it into. It's passed the House already, and I think we have a very good shot on this in the Senate soon. And this would, in effect, prevent employers. Well, it would require employers to make reasonable accommodation to the needs of pregnant employees. In other words, if a pregnant employee can't lift a heavy object, it would say, you can't make her do that. You've got to find some other thing for her to do. Now, in 1978, Congress passed the Pregnancy Discrimination Act, which says you can't discriminate against pregnant women. Unfortunately, the Supreme Court interpreted that act to say, well, you can't discriminate, which means you can't treat them worse than you treat non-pregnant people. So if you treat a non-pregnant person wonderfully, you must treat a pregnant person wonderfully. But if you treat a non-pregnant person terribly, it's okay to treat a pregnant person terribly too. So you're still requiring women to choose between their livelihoods and their babies or their own health. And the Pregnant Workers Fairness Act would stop that. And as I said, it passed the House, and I'm pretty sure the Senate will pass it fairly soon. And one other thing, we've passed legislation to abolish the deadline or to extend the deadline for ratifying the ERA, which now has 38 states that have ratified it. And the question is that Congress put on a ratification deadline and then extended that. And is that effective without our extending again?
Mm-hmm. Okay, and one one more social justice issue that you're so deeply engaged in. So really, look, a big thank you for your time. Just one thing I just want to pass on to you. We'll pass it on through official channels. But while you're here, we're working hard on a big event for us, the Israel Parade, Celebrate Israel Parade on Fifth Avenue. We haven't been on the streets for the last 2 years because of COVID. And for us as JCRC, as the organizer of that parade, this is a big moment, and it's very important for us and to bring the community, to bring our elected officials to march up Fifth Avenue. As you know, the parade is non-political, non-partisan. It's simply around recognizing the importance of Israel. I think this year it will have special resonance because we haven't been on the streets for 2 years, and also because of the events in Colleyville. And I think it's very important that the community will show that it's proud to march. It's not afraid to be on the street. So Dave, please put on your diary, and we hope we will.
I haven't missed an Israel parade as far as I can remember.
Okay, so then in that case, we will meet. Either we will meet there, or maybe the other place we'll meet in Miriam, the restaurant with the anti-Semitic graffiti, which is about halfway between your apartment and mine. And maybe we'll get a chance. I was there actually just today to go by and speak with the owner to show support. And I think it's just. And there were many people there, I think, who were there also as just a sign of solidarity. And I think it's a solidarity that we, as the Jewish community, have to show not only when these incidents happening regarding the Jewish community, but also with wider hate crimes. And that's certainly going to be something we'll continue to work with you on, and on the security grants, and on combating hate, and working with our fellowships to engage communities. And really a big thank you for your engagement and support with JCRC for so many years. And we'll see you, if not before, on Fifth Avenue.
God willing.
Great. Thank you very much for joining us. All the best.
Take care.
Thank you. Thank you.